Hello everybody, I am Tom and you are watching my Speculative class guide series for Larian Studios' upcoming Baldur's Gate 3. As noted, because Baldur's Gate 3 is not out yet and we don't know everything, this video is speculative. This is based off the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition ruleset, which Larian has said they're going to base their own ruleset off as closely as practical, so I feel pretty confident using it as a baseline for these videos. If you're unaware of any of the basic concepts around D&D or Baldur's Gate more generally, I have a tutorial kind of video about the basics of D&D that you can find right here, or in the description. But without further ado, today we're going to take a look at... The Warlock is a spellcasting class that doesn't learn their spells like a wizard, but neither are their powers inherent like that with a sorcerer. The powers of a Warlock are gifted to them by a patron, and this quote-unquote gift comes with conditions. Whether it's signing a contract with a devil, or making a deal with a mischievous archfey, or even siphoning power off a great old and ancient being, where you may not even consciously be aware that you're taking its power, a Warlock gains their power from another and wields it ultimately in service to whatever being granted them this power. As always, I'll go over the features in order of acquisition, starting with the inherent ones. For your hit points, the Warlock has a 1d8 for a hit die. This means that at first level you get 8 hit points plus your Constitution modifier. At all higher levels, you get either a roll a d8, or you can take the average, which is 5, plus your Constitution modifier, and that will give you that much extra HP every level above first. As far as proficiencies, they are proficient in light armor, simple weapons. A Warlock doesn't usually just rely solely on the powers of their patron. They often take up arms and armor as a second line of defense if their magic fails them. They don't have any tool proficiencies, and their saving throws they are proficient in wisdom and charisma. And they get to choose 2 skills from either Arcana, Deception, History, Intimidation, Investigation, Nature, and Religion. At level 1, when you choose this class, you can choose what sort of being you've struck a deal with. I alluded to them earlier, but your choices are either an Archfey, which is an incredibly ancient and powerful denizen of the Feywild. You can choose a Fiend. This can be either a chaotic demon or a calculating devil, or I guess technically a neutral evil Yugoloth. Although they tend not to be patrons, they tend not to need servants very often, so they tend not to actually be patrons from my experience. Or finally, you can choose the Great Old One. Think of a Cthulhu-esque horror like H.P. Lovecraft type feel. Your choice here will give you a feature at 1st level, 6th level, and 10th level, but we'll go over them specifically a bit later in the video. These are effectively your subclass choice. You do this right at the start at level 1. Also at level 1, you gain the ability to cast spells. A Warlock is a little different to other spellcasters, as they only have a few spell slots, and those spell slots are always of the same level. As a reference on the table that's up right now, you can see, say, a Warlock at level 5 has 2 spell slots, both of which are level 3. This means that all spells the Warlock casts are at level 3, even if it's a lower level spell. For instance, Witch Bolt is a 1st level spell, but if this same 5th level Warlock were to cast it, he would cast it at 3rd level, increasing its damage output and effectiveness. It's also worth noting here that the spell slots that you get for a Warlock, you get all your spell slots back on a short rest rather than a long rest. But moving on to level 2, when you reach level 2, you gain 2 Eldritch Invocations. These are kind of little perks, similar in a lot of ways to feats, that will power up or diversify your Warlock skills. I'll go over these again specifically closer to the end, but you gain more of these as you level up, as seen in the column on the far right of the table that I have up right now. When you reach level 3, your patron grants you a gift for your service. You can choose one of the following features. Firstly, there is Pact of the Chain. You learn the Find Familiar spell, and you can cast it as a ritual. A ritual spell doesn't require a spell slot to use, but it takes about an hour to cast, i.e. you can't cast it in combat. Along with the normal forms that your familiar can take, it can also take the form of either an imp, a pseudo-dragon, a quasit, or a sprite. For reference here, an imp is a very low-level little devil. A pseudo-dragon is a dragon that's about the size of a cat. Quite cool. A quasit is very similar to an imp, but it is a demon rather than a devil. The difference being one is chaotic, one is lawful. And a sprite is like a small fairy-type creature. Interesting point here is that the imp, the quasit, and the sprite can all talk. So that is something that you can have. They can actually communicate with you verbally if you choose one of them. It's also worth noting that when you take the attack action, you can let your familiar attack in your place, which is quite useful if you want to get, for instance, if you have an imp, they can fly. So if you've got someone up, an archer up on like a tree, you can send your imp up and attack with your imp. Next up, you have Pact of the Blade. A Warlock from this pact gets a weapon. They can create a weapon out of thin air. They just summon it into their hand. You can choose the form that this weapon takes when you summon it, and whenever you're wielding it, you automatically have proficiency with it, whether or not you would. So for instance, if you summon a glaive, you have proficiency with that glaive, even though you don't normally. It's also worth noting that weapon counts as magical for getting past resistances. If your weapon's more than 5 feet away from you for longer than a minute, it will disappear, and you can just summon it again back to your hand. If you find an actual weapon that's really cool and you want to use that, you can spend an hour, or specifically a short rest, to kind of attune to that weapon, and it becomes your Pact weapon. And from that point on, it's held in an extra dimensional space, and when you summon your Pact weapon again, it is that weapon. It's really, really cool. I love this feature. You can also change this weapon whenever you like, so you can, if you find another weapon that you think is cooler, you can instead use that weapon, and it just takes another short rest and another ritual, and then that is now your Pact weapon. And finally, we have Pact of the Tome. Your patron gives you a grimoire. When you take this feature, you can choose 3 cantrips from any available in the game. Literally, you can just choose any cantrip, irrespective of class. As long as your grimoire is on your person, you can cast those cantrips at will. If you lose your grimoire, which incidentally is known as the Book of Shadows, you can perform a ritual over the course of a long or short rest, and this will give you a replacement from your patron, and when you get that replacement, the original is destroyed. At level 4, and again at level 8, as with all classes, you gain either a feat or an ability score improvement, but with that, we can actually move on to the features determined by your choice of patron. Firstly, your choice will determine a list of additional spells that you can learn. It's worth noting that they don't necessarily learn these spells, they're just added to the list of spells that you can learn. Honestly, when I run a game of D&D, I just let my Warlock players have all of these spells. As long as when they reach the requisite level, they can just get these spells. They're already limited on their spell slots anyway, so it isn't like it's giving them all that much more power, it's just adding to their versatility. But my house rules are kind of a digression here. As I've been talking, all the additional spells that are added to the lists are up right now, depending on patron, so just pause your screen and have a look if you want to look through each of them. But now we can move on to the specifics of each, starting with the Archfey. Starting at level 1, when you choose the Archfey as your patron, you gain the ability to magically augment your presence to those around you. As an action, you can cause each creature in a 10-foot cube originating from you to make a wisdom saving throw. On a failed save, they are charmed or frightened by you. You choose which, you can choose whether they're charmed or frightened, until the end of your next turn. You can only use this feature once per short rest. When you reach level 6, as a servant of an Archfey, you gain the Misty Escape feature. Once per short rest, when you take damage, you can use your reaction to turn invisible and teleport up to 60 feet away. You then remain invisible until the start of your next turn. It's really, really cool. Finally, at level 10, you gain Beguiling Defenses. Your patron teaches you how to reflect the effect of mind-altering magic back at your attackers. For starters, you're immune to all charm effects, and whenever another creature attempts to charm you, you may use your reaction to reflect that spell. The creature has to succeed on a wisdom saving throw, or it's charmed by you for 1 full minute. It's the ultimate, no you! Moving on to the Fiend Patron. At level 1, when you choose this patron, you gain the Dark One's Blessing. When you reduce a creature to 0 hit points, you gain temporary hit points equal to your Charisma modifier plus your Warlock level. Now that I'm reading through this, I realize I have to actually explain what temporary HP is. In essence, it's a shield over the top of your health. If I am a Warlock with 25 HP, and I gain 6 temporary hit points, if I get hit by an attack that does 7 damage, the temporary hit points will absorb the first 6 damage, and it means I'll only take 1, leaving me with 24 HP and no temporary hit points left. It's relatively simple, it's just like an extra health pool that goes on top of your own. It won't heal you, it just goes on top. It's always confused me the way they call it temporary hit points. I feel like they could come up with a better term that is less confusing to people, because a lot of people don't understand how they work. But moving on to level 6, you gain Dark One's Own Luck. You can call upon your patron to slightly alter fate in your favour. When you make an ability check or a saving throw, you can add a d10 to your roll. You can only do this once per short rest, but it can save your ass pretty handily a lot of the time. A d10 is usually adding a fair amount, average of 6, so it's a lot of the time will help you in a saving throw, particularly if you're falling off a cliff or something. And then at level 10, you gain Fiendish Resistance. You choose a type of damage when you finish a rest, either short or long, and you gain resistance to that damage until you choose another one. You can just pick any damage type you like and you just gain resistance to it. Magic weapons and silvered weapons ignore this resistance. That's a lore thing. Silvered weapons work against demons and devils, and that's why that affects you as well. But finally, we move on to the Great Old One. The Great Old One is so far beyond comprehension of people from the material plane that trying to learn more about a being from this dimension beyond our own almost inevitably leads to madness. As such, lots of warlocks with these patrons are often not quite right in the head, and they can manifest this psychosis in others. Starting at level 1, when you choose this patron, you gain universal telepathy. You don't need to speak the same language as the being you're telepathically communicating to, it just translates automatically, although the creature must be smart enough to be able to understand some form of speech in the first place. Moving on to level 6, you gain Entropic Ward. If an enemy attacks you, you can use your reaction to impose disadvantage on the roll. If the attack then misses, you gain advantage on them the next round. Really, really cool. Again, this is once per rest that you can use this. You can only use this once per rest. And then finally, at level 10, you gain Thought Shield. You can no longer have your mind read by any means whatsoever unless you allow it. And you also have resistance to psychic damage. Additionally, whenever a creature attacks you with psychic damage, 100% of that damage is also taken by the attacker. Now, the final thing I'm going to go over is the Eldritch Invocations. Before I start with these though, and there are quite a few I need to list through, but I want to discuss Eldritch Blast. It is a cantrip that the Warlocks can get, and it is somewhat their bread and butter. Many of the following invocations are designed specifically around buffing that spell and make it as powerful as possible. It is in essence just like a magical laser beam that does force damage. I'm hoping that in Baldur's Gate 3 the invocations change up how the spell looks as well as its effects. Because Warlocks will be spamming this spell a lot, it's really good. One, it's a cantrip, so you can use it as often as you like, unlike your spells where you're quite limited because of your limited spell slots. And two, it's incredibly powerful, particularly after it's been amped up by a few of these invocations. So I just hope that the visual look updates to make it a bit more interesting when you're playing a Warlock. But in any case, let's list through those invocations. Some of these invocations do have prerequisites, so I will list them when it's actually relevant. But first off, we have Agonizing Blast. It has a prerequisite that you need to know the Eldritch Blast cantrip, but you can cast Eldritch Blast. You add Charisma modifier to the damage it deals every time you hit it. It just ups the damage of your cantrip. Very, very good. As I said, you can power up Eldritch Blast quite a lot. Next we have Armor of Shadows. You can cast Mage Armor on yourself at will without expending a spell slot or material components. Very, very useful. Mage Armor essentially just, it ups your AC, which makes you a lot harder to hit. Very useful for spellcasters. And the fact that you can effectively do this as a cantrip, this allows you to just do this whenever you want. It's quite powerful. Next we get Ascendant Step. This requires you to be 9th level, so it's one of the ones you get later on, but you can cast Levitate on yourself at will without expending a spell slot. Next we have Beast Speech. You can speak with animals at will without expending a spell slot. Again, speak with animals is like a spell, but effectively what this means is you can just always speak to animals. Next we have Beguiling Influence. You gain proficiency in the Deception and Persuasion skill. That's just literally a buff to your skills. Quite good. Bewitching Whispers has a prerequisite of 7th level, so you need to be 7th level before you can do it. You can cast Compulsion, however, you do actually have to expend your Warlock spell slot to do it. You also can't do this again until you finish a long rest. Next, we have the Book of Ancient Secrets. This prerequisite is you have to be a Pact of the Tome Warlock, you have to have that feature, but you can inscribe magical rituals into your Book of Shadows. Choose 2 1st level spells that have the ritual tag from any class of spell list. They don't need to be from the same spell list, and those spells appear in the book and don't count against the number of spells you know. With the Book of Shadows in hand, you can cast the chosen spells as rituals. You can't cast the spells except as rituals unless you've learned them by some other means, and you can also cast a Warlock spell you know as a ritual if it has the ritual tag. On your adventures, you can also add rituals to your spellbook if you find them, so if you find like a spell scroll, then you can actually transcribe that, again, as long as it's a ritual spell. Apparently this takes 2 hours and 50 gold pieces worth of rare inks. It's interesting to see how they're going to do inks and things like that, actually, because wizards, that comes up a lot, because wizards transcribe stuff into their spellbook, and they spend a lot of money on paper and ink. Moving on, we have Devil's Sight. You can see normally in darkness, both magical and mundane, to a distance of 120 feet. That's pretty huge, actually. Being able to see through magical darkness, you get this and then you learn the darkness spell. You can just cast a darkness spell you can see normally and no one else can. Pretty amazing. Next we have Dreadful Word. Again, this is 7th level before you can get Dreadful Word, but you can cast Confusion using a Warlock spell slot. You can't do so again until a long rest. Moving on, we have Eldritch Sight. You can cast Detect Magic at will without spending a spell slot, so you can just detect magic wherever you go. Eldritch Spear, again, this is one that buffs Eldritch Blast, so you need to know that spell before you can get it. But when you cast it, its range is 300 feet, which is ludicrous. 300 feet. That's longer than a longbow range. It's absolutely stupid. But moving on, we have Eyes of the Runekeeper. You can read all writing. Doesn't matter what language it is, you can read it. It's interesting it's always been DN discretion as far as I'm aware whether or not you can read coded languages. But I've always taken it as you've got like these arcane powers, so you can see through codes as far as I'm concerned when I'm DMing. Next we have Fiendish Vigor. You can cast False Life on yourself at will as a first level spell without expending a spell slot or material components. Next we move on to Gaze of Two Minds. You can use your action to touch a willing humanoid and perceive through its senses until the end of your next turn. As long as a creature is on the same plane of existence as you, you can use your action on subsequent turns to maintain this connection, extending the duration until the end of your next turn. While perceiving through the other creature's senses, you benefit from any special senses possessed by that creature, and you are blinded and deafened to your own surroundings. Next we have Mask of Many Faces. Very, very good. You can cast Disguise Self at will without expending a spell slot. Disguise Self effectively just puts an illusion around yourself to make you look like whatever you want, as long as it's vaguely the same size as you. It's fantastic, and you can just do that whenever you want. It's amazing. Next we have Minions of Chaos. You have to be 9th level before you can get this, but you can cast Conjure Elemental once using a Warlock spell slot, and you can't do this again until you finish a long rest. Conjure Elemental is pretty powerful, but again, you're level 9 by that point, so... Next we have Mire of the Mind. This has a prerequisite of 5th level. You can cast Slow once using a Warlock spell, and again, you can't do this until you finish a long rest. Next we have Misty Vision. You can cast Silent Image at will without expending a spell slot or material components. One with Shadows. Prerequisite, level 5. When you're in an area of dim light or darkness, you can use your action to become invisible until you move or take an action or reaction. Really, really good if you're like waiting for a patrol to walk past. You can just effectively stand up in the open, but you're just like in some dim light and you just, whoop, you're invisible until they walk past and then you can sneak past. Quite cool. Otherworldly Leap. You need to be 9th level before you can use this, but you can cast Jump on yourself at will without expending a spell slot or material component. Jump just extends your jump range and height and all that kind of thing. Next we have Repelling Blast. Once again, it's a buff to Eldritch Blast. When you hit a creature with Eldritch Blast, you can push the creature up to 10 feet away from you in a straight line. You notice here that it gives literally no specifics on size of creature, weight of creature. You can literally hit something with an Eldritch Blast, it could be an enormous demon, and you can, like, 30 feet tall, and you can blast it, just blast it back 10 feet. It's insane. Moving on, we have Sculptor of Flesh. You need to be 7th level before you get this, but you can cast Polymorph on yourself, it takes a spell slot, and you can't do so again until you finish a long rest. Sign of Ill Omen is next. You need to be 5th level, and you can cast Bestow Curse using one of your spell slots. You can't do so again until you finish a long rest. Then we have Thief of Five Fates. I can't believe I said that right the first time. You can cast Bane once using a Warlock spell slot, and you can't do so again until you finish a long rest. Bane is just the opposite of Bless. Essentially, it gives a debuff to an enemy. Thirsting Blade. Prerequisites, you need to be level 5. You also need to be Pact of the Blade. But you can attack with your Pact weapon twice instead of once whenever you take the attack action on your turn. If you do Pact of the Blade, I would suggest getting this as soon as you can at level 5, like doubling your damage output effectively. Next, we have Voice of the Chainmaster. As you might expect, you need to be Pact of the Chain before you can get this, but you can communicate telepathically with your familiar and perceive through your familiar's senses as long as you're on the same plane of existence. Additionally, while perceiving through your familiar's senses, you can also speak through your familiar in your own voice, even if your familiar is normally incapable of speech. Next, we have Whispers of the Grave. You need to be level 9 before you can get this, but you can cast Speak with Dead at will without expending a spell slot. But that's all of them. So there's, as I said, quite a few. Lots that you can go through. There is a few more, but they all require, like, their prerequisites are level 15. So they're actually higher than what the max level in Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be. So I left them out. But moving on to kind of my thoughts and advice. Now, for build suggestions, for starters, Charisma is your spellcasting ability score, so as far as the race suggestions go, it's going to be the same as what I did with the Sorcerer last week, which is to say Drow, Half-Elves, Tieflings, all fantastic Warlock choices. It's worth noting that Warlocks often use weapons to supplement their damage as well, so a secondary stat in either Strength or Dexterity is also recommended depending on your weapon choice. And moving on to your subclass choice, all of them are quite fun and balanced in my mind. I've always found the Great Old One to be the least useful in D&D. However, That is because they're far more situational. Their powers are very specific about certain situations. And the situations in which they're good, well, essentially exactly Baldur's Gate 3. They are the perfect counter to Mind Flayers. Almost all of their abilities are designed around protection from, or the ability to fight with, psychic combatants. Which is literally just pass and part. That's what Illithids are. Mind Flayers just are psychic beings. That's what they are. Also notably that Mind Flayers are the same ilk as the Great Old One. They're both aberrations originating from the Far Realm. So the role-playing potential there is also probably really high if you take this as a subclass for the Warlock, because you're fighting enemies that are the same, from the same place as your patron is. So it's kind of this cool connection that you have with the bad guys. I'm going to be interested to see how that comes into play. But, in any case, I think that's it. So, if you like this video, please leave a like. If you aren't subscribed, please consider subscribing. And as always, thank you for watching, and I shall see you next time. Bye guys.